Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show from Stricken, Aberdeenshire in Scotland, where we take a fresh look at the economics of the COVID-19 crisis. When we last looked at this issue a few weeks ago, governments around the world were just starting to announce their emergency economic packages to deal with the economic impact of lockdown. In today's show, we asked Vicky Pryce, the former head of the Government Economic Service in the UK, which countries may have judged it right. Is a rapid recovery possible, or are we set inevitably for a bout of prolonged economic recession? And we asked leading Scottish economic commentator George Kerevan what new thinking might emerge from this crisis. But first it is Mina in Glasgow, with your tweets, your emails and your messages.
Thank you, Alex. First of all, in response to our extended interview with Sir Harry Burns, the former Chief Medical Officer for Scotland, Mike says, "This is a fascinating interview, long, in-depth and totally riveting. An absolute eye-opener, and I really hope people in power take it on board and take action." Tracy says, "This is the best interview I've listened to and makes a lot more sense than what we have to listen to on the news, where the politicians seem to tell us very little." And Wilma says, "Wish you were still our CMO, Harry." Then, in response to our show last week on media and the pandemic, featuring award-winning journalists Peter Oborne and Chris Hedges from both sides of the Atlantic, Lewis says, "Love the show. Interesting look at what the press are saying. I'm in no doubt that they will increase their criticism of the Prime Minister and his government." Rona says, "It must be scary living in the USA. So little humanity in policy development." She then goes on to say, "Agree, we have huge inequality too." Norma says, "The print media is dying, but it's mostly their own fault. Bias and lies, that's what they print. I haven't bought a newspaper for years, but I get all and truthfully on social media." Gemma says, "Newspapers have brought on their own demise by reporting biased news." And finally, Scott says, "There is no way to run a pandemic government. Just save lives and live right."
The lockdown of the better part of the world economy is an event without precedent in world history. Never before has a world recession been engineered as a deliberate act of policy to tackle a health crisis. Vicky Pryce is the Chief Economic Advisor of the Centre for Economic and Business Research. She's also former head of the Government Economic Service in the United Kingdom. Who better to assess the prospects for economic recovery? Vicky Pryce now joins me from London. Vicky Pryce, what do the first quarter economic figures tell us about the impact of the lockdown on the world economy?
Basically, we're seeing a contraction which is spread across the world. And I think one of the interesting issues is, first of all, how much sharper will the Q2 contraction be? And it's likely to be pretty sharp because we are beginning to feel some of those outcomes just now in the Western world anyway. The question then, of course, is what type of long-term impact that will have, and whether that recovery that we're all hoping will happen at some point is quite sharp, as the International Monetary Fund hopes, or whether we're going to have quite a protracted period during which we're trying to get out of this recession, which is the largest we've seen really since the great crash in the early part of the 20th century. And whether, therefore, that is going to leave scars for quite some time, and the economies simply aren't going to recover, and trade won't recover anything like what we used to see before for a number of years since the financial crisis. So it's telling us we're in recession, basically. That's what the data is suggesting.
The countries, the major economies, have been flinging what could only be described as economic howitzers at the recession, at the crisis. What policies have impressed you the most thus far?
I think all governments have been very prepared to engage in quite a lot of borrowing in order to sustain the economy. So fiscal rules have been abandoned. I think the governments have learned from the financial crisis. It's exactly what was needed then, but it was slightly easier because we had one problem to deal with, the banking system, trying to avoid the credit crunch from causing huge financial instability. That was more easily handleable, but this is quite unprecedented because we have it both ways, that we're not trying to expand demand, which is what we were trying to do then, but what we're trying to do now is sustain the population and businesses while we're pushing demand and supply down at the same time.
Now, this is quite unprecedented for central banks to be buying assets on this scale, but would you say it's justified given the unprecedented nature of the economic crisis?
Oh, completely and utterly justified. We must remember that the European Central Bank has been doing this for a long period of time, of course. It's not new for them. And since 2015, they have been buying quite aggressively. But we've now abandoned concerns about how much we do. The UK, for example, has been able to sell its bonds and finance a huge deficit it's going to have this year, estimated at something like £300 billion. Mainly because the central bank has been behind it, printing money, you could call it, and promising to buy all those bonds that others will acquire back from them. So they know that there's someone there to make the market for them, that the risk is very small, and therefore the Bank of England has been able, with the support, the Treasury rather, has been able, with the support of the Bank of England, to go out to the markets and issue lots of bonds at very low rates, which it can then use, or the money of it used to fund and guarantee quite a lot of the activities that are going on right now in the market and to sustain the economy, basically. Without that, whether Bank of England, Bank of Japan, the ECB, the Fed, but also there's been quite a lot of support in China and elsewhere. Without that, I think we would have seen a much, much faster deterioration in economic conditions in many countries.
Now, thus far, some countries have been substantially more successful in containing the virus than others. South Korea, Taiwan, in Europe, Greece and Germany. Will these countries be insulated from the economic effects, or will they be caught up in a general downturn in the world economy and world trade?
The worrying thing about the world economy is that it was already slowing down very significantly before the crisis hit. What we have seen is that the trade disputes between China and the US in particular had already reduced Chinese growth quite substantially, had already reduced growth in loads of other parts of the world. Japan wasn't exporting an awful lot to China because China wasn't growing particularly. Germany wasn't exporting much to China. What we had seen in Europe, in fact, is a few quarters of contraction in some of the big economies there. That included, actually, Germany. It also included the UK, because we were also affected here by that slowdown in trade. And that had been a worry in any case. And one of the reasons why monetary policy had been relaxed already before we go to this crisis had been because the central banks were trying to sustain growth in the various regions and countries for which they were responsible. And we saw the ECB get into the market again, quite aggressively back in November, if I remember correctly, of last year. It is a very unusual situation. So if there isn't a resumption of trade pretty soon, to the extent that that sustains the world economy, we see now how important trade is, then countries that have done quite well in terms of containing the virus are still going to be affected by the slowdown in trade. And we're hearing, of course, the possible resumption of trade hostilities between the US and China, which, of course, is going to be affecting markets all across the world.
Now, some economists and indeed some political leaders have been putting forward hopes that there might be a substantial economic recovery at the back end of this year and into 2021. Is there any real prospect of a V-shaped recovery, as it's called, or are we more likely in for a period of prolonged world recession?
We don't know. That's the interesting thing. If you look at China, and the data has come out of it, they went into quite a decline in the first quarter. So what we saw is quite a dip in industrial production in particular. If you look at what's been happening recently, the April data, after 2 months of very serious decline, show an increase again. So China is moving out of it. There is no real reason why other countries, if there is the lockdown, shouldn't either. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that when we compare what's going on right now with what happened in the financial crisis back in 2008, 2009, the advanced world went into recession very quickly. It didn't last very long. It was a V-shaped one. But at the time, we had the developing world Oil prices were still quite high, commodity prices were high, actually doing reasonably well. And it was just as the advanced world was recovering that some of those countries went into recession because oil prices fell, commodity prices fell. So there was a bit of a balancing out that was taking place. This time, it seems to be the case that the developing world is also going to see a fall this year. And getting out of that for them might actually be much more difficult than was the case back in the time of the financial crisis, because many have very high debts now. Lots of countries have much higher debts now than they did at the beginning of the financial crisis. And of course, they will have difficulty, particularly as they have to intervene in their own economies to pay back some of this or to have any credit worthiness left. So there'll be defaults, write-offs of debt. It's not going to be an easy period for the world economy for a while. So yeah, I think a V-shape is unlikely.
In your recent book, Women versus Capitalism, you put forward the view that women still face substantial obstacles in terms of business and the economy in developing careers and going into positions of influence. Do you anticipate that women might also get the harsh end of the economic impact of the COVID-19 crisis?
But a lot of it, of course, is linked to the slowdown in the economy. The International Monetary Fund has calculated that at times of recession and slowdown, women suffer most. And of course, they tend to be the poorest members of society because there is a big wage gap and they do the types of jobs which are the margin of society quite a lot, or they work at home, not paid, and they're the ones who are most likely to fall into poverty. So yes, I worry. And what is happening also in the developed world is that quite a lot of the pressures for gender equality seem to have eased a little bit right now and probably will not be at the forefront of any recovery that takes place. We've seen here in the UK, for example, the requirement for big firms to publish their pay reviews, which show the gaps that they have in their organizations between men and women, has been delayed. And that, of course, is a worry. Are we going to be going backwards rather than forwards? And how long will it take for that recovery again in the position of women that has been lagging so behind take place? And will it be slowed down because of this? And those are the main concerns. And if you look at data, it does suggest indeed that women and the young have been the worst affected in this crisis.
Join us after the break, where we continue our discussion with economist Vicky Pryce. Welcome back. I'm discussing with Vicky Pryce, the former head of the Government Economic Service in the United Kingdom, about the efficacy of the financial policies being pursued by governments around the world. Will they result in a V-shaped recovery, or are we more set for a bout of prolonged recession? Vicky Pryce, do you anticipate that when the bills have to be settled at some point after the crisis is over, that policymakers around the world will be looking for different means of raising taxations to close some of the substantial fiscal gaps? Are there any opportunities in terms of the economics effect of the crisis? For example, a renewed interest in carbon taxes, given the substantial fall in the resource price, that might offer themselves as more attractive policy options than normal?
From an economic viewpoint, it's a carbon tax that we need, there's no doubt about it, because that, of course, encourages all sorts of behaviors that make it much more likely that we get to a solution which will use less fossil fuel, or even move into the area of carbon capture and storage, or alternative fuels that you can get out of fossil fuels that can be used in a certain way by not being as polluting as just oil and gas are at present. There is a huge opportunity to construct an industrial policy in various countries that is greener in the future than what we had before, if we are indeed to meet some of the climate change targets that have been set in many countries by law, which certainly is the case in the UK. So I see it both as an opportunity, but also as a worry that in the attempts to get growth back, we might forget what we've learned perhaps from this crisis.
On the same theme, what changes would you expect to see in the economies once this crisis is finally over?
Well, one interesting one would be what happens to the way we work. There is now a serious discussion about whether one needs all this commercial property that's out there. One shadows to think what this will mean for all our pensions, given that quite a lot of money is invested in property, certainly in the UK, but in many advanced nations too. But will it mean that we work more from home? I think what is very interesting is looking at developments in some countries. Germany, for example, is thinking of legislating that people can, as of right, work from home if that's what they want. Maybe globalization will go backwards because we need to be close to our supply chains. Maybe there'll be a lot more onshoring, all these things that are now sort of puzzling people. How exactly do we make it work? And also the role of the state, much bigger role, because so many companies are going to be requiring systems. They already are, and they will find it difficult to stand on their own 2 feet or however many they've got if that support is withdrawn. And I think the banking system will look different too. They're going to have quite a lot of difficulty getting any of their loans back, even though they're guaranteed by the state in many places. And then the consumer might just change their habits. I think they still want to go out and eat, but they might be much, much more careful how they spend that money in the future. And they'll be worried about this type of event happening again. So I think psychology will play a very important role here. Confidence, if it returns, will be a great thing, but it will take some time.
Vicky Pryce from London, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you.
Now, in the aftermath of this extraordinary economic crisis, which has followed the global pandemic, will new economic thinking emerge as countries come to terms with the full economic ramifications of COVID-19? I turn to George Kerevan, a leading economic thinker in Scotland and a former SNP Member of Parliament. George Kerevan joins me from Edinburgh. Now, the big economies, all economies, have wheeled out the big guns in order to confront the economic consequences of lockdown. But in these unprecedented positions of an induced world recession, induced as a deliberate act of policy, isn't this exactly the moment where central banks are justified in a substantial asset purchases, quantitative easing, printing money? Isn't this exactly the situation where that unprecedented action is justified?
I think you're right. And what amazed me was how quickly, it was a matter of microseconds before the big central banks went back to cranking up the money machine, trying to pump more cash into the economy. The trouble is, they'd already used that mechanism over the last decade. They'd got interest rates down to rock bottom. So though more money is being printed now, it's essentially going to replacing lost taxes during the lockdown. It's not actually adding extra demand to the global economy in a way that would expand investment and expand output, which is why I think ultimately the solution, if you want to get the global economy back on track and growth back up to trend, is going to be more in an immediate fiscal injection, not monetary policy, not essentially keeping interest rates down, which is what monetary policy has been used for to date. I think governments are going to have to use the money they're printing from the central banks and pump it directly into the economy, directly into investment, directly into purchases. Interest rates are already at rock bottom, Alex, so what we need to do is to put money directly into spending, and you're seeing some governments begin to do that. Chinese governments began to do that. Even Trump's government is beginning to do that in America. Not so much yet in Europe.
But turning to the UK economics just now, while criticism has been mounting against the Prime Minister's handling of the crisis, the Chancellor has been getting rave reviews. The new Chancellor of the Exchequer seems to be the darling of much of the media commentary. Is that praise justified, or is there more that should be being done by the UK Exchequer?
Actually, the Bank of England have just been giving the Chancellor cash directly. So he's got no shortage of spending power at the moment. And if you feel shortage of spending power, then you can look good. I think the real test for the Chancellor is what happens after the lockdown. It could well be that the Chancellor thinks he can resort to an old-fashioned gambit, which is to boost inflation. And of course, if inflation goes up in the medium term, then the value of the debt that the government has contracted will fall in real terms. So I think the Chancellor might find it hard to raise taxes and freeze public sector pay in the immediate aftermath of the lockdown. But I think he might look candidly towards a little bit of inflation to help the economy along.
What sign of new and different thinking do you see, George Kerevan, emerging from this crisis?
I cannot imagine there's the political will to go back to another bout of austerity to pay off the substantial sums of money that governments have borrowed across the world. So there's going to have to be other ways of funding government from now on. Now, there's a new set of theories called modern monetary theory. And essentially it says that it's actually quite a good thing for governments to borrow, because when they borrow, they are issuing government bonds, and those bonds are a kind of wealth. And just to be very simplified about it, where does your pension come from? You have to save. What can you save in? Well, you buy. Your pension fund buys government bonds. Government borrowing is actually quite a good thing, because on the long term it underpins people's pensions. So there might well be a rethink across the world about government borrowing, and seeing it as a more positive thing that we've seen in the era of austerity over the last 20 years.
But that would be a very substantial change in economic thinking. I mean, when the economies have been as indebted as they will be emerging from this crisis, after the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, after the World Wars of the 20th century, then haven't they tended to be followed by a period of austerity which has been justified on the basis of balancing the books?
Well, I mean, the curious thing, if you look at the Second World War, which is the bit I can remember, there was an initial view that, yes, having borrowed vast amounts of money, I mean, the British national debt was running at twice of GDP, I mean, twice what it is at the moment. There was an immediate thought, well, maybe we'll have to, tighten our belts and pay all this off. But, I mean, that actually didn't happen at the end of the Second World War. We more or less grew our way out of it. The Americans, bless their cotton socks, came up with the Marshall Plan and came up with a lot of money initially. But by the 1950s, we were actually borrowing a lot more. We'd moved over to funding the economy through personal debt. And that the huge wodge of public debt left over from fighting the war, that was just left there really through to the end of the 1960s, and it gradually lost its real value through inflation. So the lesson of the Second World War is that we didn't really rush to austerity. We had 20 or 30 years of quite positive growth and inflation, and let the debt mountain just disappear in real terms. I suspect there will be a debate over, austerity versus growing the economy. I think that the bankers, who always get kind of conservative about this, might be pressuring the Chancellor to move towards austerity. But I think he will find it very difficult in political terms to get away with that once we've all come out of lockdown. So I think we're into a new political era, and there'll be big debates about how to get out of this. And I think political movements that just simply want to go back to the old austerity line of business, I think they will find it very difficult to achieve that.
And finally, George Kerevan, if you were still gracing the green benches of the House of Commons, what single policy prescription would you be offering to the Chancellor as a way of helping to come out of this economic crisis? And what policy option do you believe the Scottish Government should be pursuing to show that they've got new thinking to meet these different times?
Well, the policy that has bubbled up and is now being discussed north and south of the border is introducing a universal basic income. The idea being, let's get rid of all the baggage and the bureaucracy of of the different welfare systems, which don't work anyway, which put people through misery trying to fill in all the forms, and which are means tested. Let's just have a basic income that everybody gets, which takes care of basic needs. And that, in a sense, saves you a lot of money because you can get rid of a lot of the bureaucracy. It saves you a lot of the mental health problems of putting people through these hoops, and actually creates a kind of a civic coming together, so that people can begin to concentrate on rebuilding the economy, thinking up new ideas for rebuilding the economy, and so on. So I think universal basic income is going to become the issue that we'll all be discussing over the next period. I noticed that the new Social Justice and Fairness Commission that the Scottish Government has set up is discussing this, and I think looking forward in time, we are going to see that major change occurring in actually how the welfare state is organised.
George Kerevan from Edinburgh, thank you very much for joining us once again on the Alex Salmond Show. We can now see pretty clearly the shape of the world economic response to the onset of the COVID-19 crisis. Most finance ministers have aimed howitzers at the pandemic with varying degrees of success. The real question is the durability of the crisis. And those countries which have been pretty successful in containing the virus, Taiwan, South Korea, Germany, Greece, New Zealand, are still looking with trepidation at those countries in Western Europe, the United States of America, which are still struggling, and indeed at the increasing signs that South America is being gripped by the pandemic. They know, the successful countries know, that world economic recovery depends on world control of the virus. In that sense, we are most definitely all in this together. In the UK, increasing questions are being asked as to why it's only now, 3 months into the crisis, that the comprehensive system of contact tracing is only just getting off the ground. Control of the virus, stomping down on the infection, would seem to be a prerequisite for economic recovery, not an afterthought. There is little point at aiming big guns at the economy if it's pea shooters which are being aimed at public health. And so from Tasmina, myself and all at the show, it's goodbye for now, stay safe, and we'll see you again next week.